The rise and fall of America's flour capital, Minneapolis, Minnesota. In 1916, mills along a single half-mile stretch of riverbank produced more flour than entire nations. One in every 5 barrels sold in America that year came from the same 80-foot drop of water. By the middle of the 20th century, the buildings that made it possible stood dark, empty, and mostly forgotten. The flour never stopped selling. The city just stopped making it. What vanished from Minneapolis was never the wheat. Chapter 1. A fall worth owning. Begin with the ledge. St. Anthony Falls dropped the Mississippi River further than any other point on its entire length. A natural accident of geology that meant nothing to anyone until a territory opened around it. For years the water simply ran, unclaimed and unused, past a handful of soldiers stationed nearby with no orders to touch it. Enter Franklin Steele. A minor clerk with no fortune and no title, Steele heard before anyone else that the land along the falls was open to claim, and he moved on the news before his superiors had finished discussing it. He built a shelter on the riverbank overnight, and by morning the ground was his. Nothing about the man suggested he understood what he'd taken. The falls would decide that for him. It took nearly a decade for Steele to raise the money to build anything at all. When the sawmill finally rose in the late 1840s, it did the one thing the site had never done in its natural state. It turned water into work. A town grew around the noise. Nobody yet knew the timber was only a rehearsal. Chapter 2. The discount nobody could explain. By the 1860s, wheat had replaced pine as the freight of choice, and two family names arrived to claim the falls the way Steele once had. Not by moonlight this time, but by capital. Enter Cadwallader Washburn, a former Union general and congressman who built, almost as an afterthought, the largest flour mill west of the Great Lakes. Enter Charles Pillsbury a few years later, a young man with borrowed money and a half share in a mill so unremarkable that no one else wanted it. It turned a profit within a year, and nobody could quite say why. Both operations ground the same wheat, a hard spring variety bred for brutal northern winters, murderous on the soft millstones built for Ohio grain. It shattered under the stone instead of splitting cleanly, and the flour that came out was always darker, always cheaper, always sold at a discount next to the pale Eastern product bakers actually wanted. Two of the largest mills in the country were, by every account, producing an inferior good. Neither man yet had the answer. The answer was already sitting in a workshop nobody had taken seriously. Chapter 3. The air that fixed the wheat. Enter Edmund Lacroix, a millwright tinkering with a machine most of his peers dismissed outright. A purifier that used air instead of cloth to separate bran from flour. Bran and flour weighed differently, even when ground to nearly the same size, and a current of air could do what a sieve never could. Within a season, the flour coming out of Washburn's mill was whiter than anything the region had produced. Pillsbury went further, replacing stone entirely with steel rollers that sheared the kernel apart in careful stages instead of crushing it in one violent pass. The Eastern discount disappeared almost overnight. Millers began calling it new processed flour, and for the first time, Minneapolis brands were compared not to Buffalo or Rochester, but to Budapest, the reigning capital of fine milling. The ledger never lies, and by the mid-1880s, the ledger said something nobody in Europe wanted to read. None of the men celebrating this yet understood what the new machinery was quietly doing to the air inside their own buildings. Chapter 4. An ordinary malfunction. On an evening in 1878, two millstones inside the Washburn mill ran empty of grain, a routine failure that happened somewhere in the district most weeks without incident. This time, the friction found 4 years of settled flour dust drifting undisturbed on every beam and ledge. The explosion tore the 7-story mill open from the inside and threw fire into 5 neighboring buildings, each one carrying decades of the same forgotten dust. 18 men did not go home that night. University researchers later proved what the district had refused to consider. Flour, suspended in the right concentration, burns like any other fuel. The finer the flour, the finer the dust, the more completely it explodes. Minneapolis had spent a decade perfecting the very quality that made its mills combustible. Washburn's response broke with every unwritten rule of the trade. The rebuilt mill was engineered entirely around dust control, and the design was given away freely to competitors who had buried men of their own. The ledger never lies, and this time it recorded something rarer than profit, an industry that shared its survival instead of patent. Patenting it. Chapter 5. The Empire with No Ceiling. Within 3 years, a new mill rose that would hold the title of largest in the world for the next 4 decades. It needed one thing the Falls alone couldn't provide: a supply of wheat with no limit on it. Enter James J. Hill, a railroad builder who completed a granite bridge across the Mississippi built for one purpose only: hauling wheat from the Canadian prairie directly into the mills with no delay and no competing line to slow it down. Wheat trains arrived at every hour, barrels stacked along the levee bound for St. Louis, New York, and Liverpool. In 1884, by every measure a statistician of the era could take, Minneapolis passed Budapest to become the leading flour milling city on earth. A settlement that had been rapids and prairie within living memory had outproduced the capital of an empire. 20 years. That was all it took. What the city hadn't solved yet was a stranger problem. A name on a sack meant nothing to the family buying bread 3 states away. Chapter 6. The Woman Invented to Answer Mail. An advertising contest in 1921 asked readers to mail back a completed puzzle for a small prize. 30,000 puzzles came back, along with hundreds of letters that had nothing to do with the contest. Women writing in with baking questions addressed, oddly, to a flour company. Enter Betty Crocker, a name borrowed and paired with nothing at all, invented so the letters could have a face to answer to. She had no body, no history, and no existence outside a signature. In time, she would outlast every founder whose name had built the district around her, better known to millions than Washburn or Pillsbury ever managed to be. The ledger never lies, and quietly, that same year, it recorded the first drop in output the district had seen in a decade. Nobody thought it worth mentioning. There was a puzzle to answer. Chapter 7. The rules that turned against the river freight. Rules that let wheat be unloaded, milled, and reshipped within a single long-haul rate had once helped Minneapolis. By the 1920s, those same rules favored whichever mill sat closest to the coast, and that mill was rarely on the Mississippi anymore. Washburn's company and Pillsbury's spent the decade quietly building new plants in Buffalo, financing their own Eclipse One mortgage at a time. By 1930, Buffalo outmilled Minneapolis for the first time since the rivalry began. A coincidence Cadwallader Washburn himself would have recognized. 64 years earlier, he'd measured his first mill against that very city as the western edge of ambition. Now it was the standard Minneapolis had fallen short of. The company that carried the Washburn name folded into a larger one that same decade and moved its offices out of the city entirely within 30 years. The address changed. The name on the letterhead did not. Chapter 8. What the River Kept. The last mill on the row ground its final batch in 1965, after 91 years of continuous work. It stood dark for over 2 decades until a fire in 1991 left nothing but scorched stone open to the sky. 12 years later, a museum opened inside the ruin, its scorch marks left deliberately unpainted, kept as the exhibit itself. Half a mile upriver, the mill that had once been the largest on earth became apartments, its dust-choked floors now carrying tenants who sleep where the world's bread was once ground into being. The city itself lost nearly a third of its population before the numbers quietly turned around again, filling the gap the mills left with banks, hospitals, and glass towers that owed nothing to wheat or water. Above it all, 2 signs advertising a flour brand still burn against the skyline each night, lit long after the product stopped being made anywhere nearby. And below all of it, unbought, unbuilt, and unbothered by any of it, the falls still dropped the river exactly as far as they did the night a clerk first saw them by moonlight. Mills rose, burned, closed, and were rebuilt into something else entirely. The one thing on that riverbank that was never anyone's to claim is the only thing still doing what it always did. It is still falling.